Heather and Bret on Dose of Leadership. Man, I'm so excited to have you guys on. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
There was a thunderstorm last night here where I live. Woke me up at 3 a.m, and I hadn't finished your book yet, and I couldn't go to sleep because I was thinking about this. I was so looking forward to this conversation. I finally finished the book from 3 a.m. to 5:30 a.m. I couldn't sleep, but I finished your book. It's so good, and let me tell you, for a long time, I felt like I've been on an island, and I don't know if you've come across people when they talk like that. I feel like I'm like just having simple conversations, common sense conversations. I feel isolated. Does that ring to you guys at all? I mean, yeah. I mean, you probably felt like an island, particularly after the Evergreen thing, but does it resonate with you when I say that?
Absolutely.
We describe it a little differently. We've talked about the feeling that we were picked up by a tornado on May 23rd of 2017, and it hasn't put us down yet. And then we sort of had the sense that it picked a lot of other people up at the beginning of the COVID pandemic.
Another metaphor we use sometimes is having gone through the looking glass. And I think, like Bret just said, it turns out there are a lot of other people who are similarly on an island, having been picked up by a tornado and having been landed somewhere else, having gone through the looking glass. But for the most part, they're not wearing that on their shirts, right? You have to find those people.
Well, I've said this, told this story a couple times on this show. But I look back at my parents. They were all married. They had a string of friends. There were 6 couples, so there were 12 people total. They all got married around 1959, 1960, and they all played bridge together because that's what people did, right? You played bridge, and all of them are dead except one for now. But I look back at that time because as we grew up as kids, and everybody, if you couldn't get a babysitter, you'd go to the house where they were playing bridge sometimes, But I remember looking at those friends and how they lived life with each other, and it was a deep love. But they were Nixon Republicans, they were Kennedy Democrats, they were Jewish, they were Catholic, they were Protestant, and they gave each other a ton of shit around the bridge table. But they loved each other deeply, and I don't even have 12 friends, to be quite honest, that I can do that with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I don't know a lot of what you write about in your book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. That loss. To me, I kept thinking back to my parents and their friends in there, and like the loss that you kind of talk about, or at least something as this path we're going down, that we're away from that and we're careening down something else. Does that make any sense, what I said?
Yeah, I think there has been a spectacular change in the way people relate to each other. And of course, the moment you point to, I hate to say it this way, but it wasn't really anywhere in particular either, right? We are on some sort of a long descent from a period in prior times when people did have extremely deep relationships with each other. And, the bridge friends would have looked alienated from each other to a hunter-gatherer who lived in a band of people that were so utterly interdependent that they were somewhere between individuals and an organism. And so, the fact that we have gone further down this path, and I think, for Heather and me, we look out at, the generation of students that we taught, for example, and see that they are even more isolated, right? Heather and I have each other, so we have a reality check built in at home, and a lot of people who are a little bit younger than us seem to be playing with the idea that that's kind of optional. And it's hard to articulate to them what they are passing up. And maybe your point suggests that we need to bootstrap a change of direction back towards this recognition of our utter interdependence that would lead us to behave in a much healthier and more satisfying way.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just you circled back to exactly the word that I was going to highlight, is the interdependence. That you relate from. You said your parents got married in 59-60. So ours, were just, a few years later than that. My parents also played bridge with their friends in the 70s when I was growing up, and it wasn't 6 couples. Maybe this is a generational change, maybe it's just an anecdote, but it was more like 3 or 4. And so I feel like, though, that reflects the move away from really deeply connected, fairly large groups, 12 people, 12 adults with kids. That's a lot. That's a big group. And increasingly now people are willing to acknowledge that they're not connected, they're disaffected, that they don't know how to connect. But then there's this patina of, and that's fine. And I choose that. And, who are you to say that having deep connections with someone else or someone's else is critical to being human? And, we're here to say, as all humans forever have said, no, actually connection is where it's at.
Well, I think that's, you speak to when I said I was on an island, it speaks to there's a gnawing, there's a craving that's constantly there for me. And I think it is connection. It's funny how I was reading in your book, you talked about campfires. Another business partner of mine on another podcast that we do, we were talking specifically about that. We're trying to build a community of people, and I said, I think 2 weeks ago in a podcast, I said, I want to sit around a campfire and see your face so I can see your soul. And then I read that pretty much the exact same thing in your book, right? And so I'm like, wow, this is amazing. But it is true. I think I think that what kind of an aha moment for me over the last 6 months is that's really where that gnawing comes from, that craving of that connection.
Well, there's a bitter pill that goes along with this recognition, though, which is for those of us who have spotted the problem and attempted to go in the other direction, I think we could probably describe it a lot of different ways, but I would say we suffer from having had the market as our developmental environment. And it causes us not to be good at collaborating in a way that if we had grown up under any sort of ancestral circumstances, we would have learned to intuit what was necessary to be good companions, collaborators, reality checks, and all of that. And so, in the attempt to get off the island or invite other people onto it, or however you would amend the metaphor, the problem is that we have to learn how to behave relative to each other, or it doesn't work. Right.
Yeah.
And that, go ahead.
Well, just, you're bringing up the market, as of course we do many times in the book as well. Unregulated market forces that are shoehorned in as a replacement for human connection. It strikes me, I'm not sure I've ever had this thought exactly before, but this concept, which I have found really horrifying since I first ran into it, but of retail therapy. Of this idea that people will find their way out of anxiety or sadness or disconnection by going and acquiring more things with their money, right, is kind of the epitome of the problem. Well, it points to the deep disconnection.
It's one part of it, which is that we learn to satisfy needs by just buying something that makes us feel momentarily better or that we think will. But there's the other aspect too, which is that a community of people that knows each other from birth, where you're born into a community, you watch people die, you watch other people enter it, everybody backwards and forwards, what they're good at seeing, what their blind spots are, right? You've seen them make errors and all of that, is a very different phenomenon than one where you source even your social connections a la carte, right? And so, for example, the idea, a psychologist, right, a good psychologist plays a role that is somewhere in the neighborhood of what a great friend might have played, what a clergy member might have been to you. It's somebody who understands you and who you can trust to put aside their interests and to let you see through their eyes, right? It has very little to do with understanding the functioning of the mind. Really, what it is somebody you can trust who listens. But what does it mean for that to be a business relationship?
I love that, because it goes to, as I've, spoke and taught leadership over the officially since 2007, I think even where I was in 2007 to where I am now, it was more about then. I think it was more internal, and now I guess my point is where I've morphed into is that the keys to unlock all of this are rooted in authenticity, transparency, and vulnerability, which we seem to kind of suck at now. And I don't know how much of that is because of this, as you point out in the book, this dependency on this growth mindset myth, right? Or the idea, as you said, is consumerism model, which as a conservative like myself, I mean, when I read that, it really woke me up because you're right, because I think that we're in this perpetual cycle that to change it is going to require some pain, but it kind of makes sense, because the other alternative is if we keep doing what we're doing, the only alternative is a massive collapse.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and the idea that we need to be vulnerable with one another, we need to be able to be vulnerable with one another, I think is exactly apt and exactly not tolerated by a landscape in which anonymous strangers or bots even can throw you to the wolves. Right, that we're interacting online in ways that we would not interact in person, and if we did, those people who said some of the things that are said online would be roundly chastised by the community. That's what community does, and there is no mechanism by which to do that online.
Well, I guess that's why I don't understand, and maybe you can talk from an evolutionary sense, because that's what was so fascinating about your book. There are so many things that, again, it's almost like, I don't know if anybody's told you this before, but it's like, you could almost, every single one of your chapters could almost be a separate book in itself, That was kind of the idea. Yes.
Right.
There's so much there, guys. It's so good. But I mean, it was fun. I felt like my brain got, I feel like I did bicep curls for my brain, if that's possible. That's the best analogy. That's what my brain felt like when I got done with it. But that's what was so fun about it, because I never looked at, the way that I lead, the way that I interact, the things I take for granted. I just didn't think about the evolutionary side of it. I mean, just for one, the one that really stuck out, I don't know why it did, but the smells one, right? I don't know why that stuck out. It was so fun just to read that. We're thinking, and I didn't realize that our body is wired, or our brain is wired, to deal or notice a CO2, right, problem. You said even some of that was brain damage, for example, could still react. Right? Am I paraphrasing?
Even people who have no panic response, people who do not frighten because they have a mental defect, the CO2 detector is so separate and ancient that it will still trigger them to feel panicky and to get out of wherever it is. Because for those who haven't read the book yet, the idea is because we exhale CO2, our ancestors will have encountered scenarios inside a cave or enclosed space where they go in and the air is breathable, but it becomes dangerous to them over time. And so we have this instinctive panic response, and it's very, very deep. And in the book, what we talk about is it would be even more useful for modern people to have a carbon monoxide detector, because our industrial processes produce carbon monoxide and people simply go to sleep and die. It puts them to sleep. It would be very useful to have a detector for that, but it's too new a hazard, and so it isn't there.
Yeah, and I guess I should ask you, and I don't know much about biology or evolution. I mean, I believe in it, and it makes sense. Would we automatically, over time, if we continue to have combustion engines and did that, would we develop over time this automatic, much like we did the CO2 detector?
Well, two things would be true. One, we did develop a carbon monoxide detector, and we now, mandate that you install them in a house. So in some sense, that's the way humans now upgrade. If
that is to say, extended phenotype rather than onboard phenotypic change.
Right. And,
I meant like internal, like the CO2, right?
The answer is, under normal circumstances, yes, it would absolutely evolve. It would take a very long time to happen, but it would evolve. But the problem is that if you just simply start the clock now, the people who it has to materially affect how many offspring people leave. So, anybody who dies from carbon monoxide poisoning but was already done reproducing and their children don't do any worse in the world for their absence, that has no impact. So, it would take even longer, because the signal that results in fewer offspring would be pretty darn weak.
Well, it would take even longer, too, because of your first answer, right? That, because humans are so extraordinary, at basically moving our evolutionary processes and products off our own bodies. Our software creates tools, and those tools are the ways that we actually manifest our success in the world. That the CO detectors that we have on our walls are the thing that are protecting us from the carbon monoxide now.
Yep.
And so, there's less selective pressure for there to be an onboard endogenous change.
Right. And this is why I wanted to bring this up, because that really gets to the heart of the book that I just find fascinating, right? Because the whole premise of this is why we're heading towards this collapse. I think we all know instinctively, intuitively, we know that, okay, something's got to change. I mean, something is drastically has to happen for things to change. But the premise of the book is like, and the reason why you go so deep on this evolutionary side, even talking about the smells piece, is that we are advancing so fast externally, right? And the reason why we're having so much challenge and problems and dealing with the challenges that we're faced with is that the hardware, or what I'm wired with, can't keep up with the progress, right? And it's just it's going so fast. Am I saying this right? I mean,
yeah,
you guys are way smarter about this than I am, but that's the take I got from it. Like, yeah, I mean, the way have evolved, it can't keep up with the progress that's happening at such an exponential rate.
Well, it's in one way even worse, right? Because you say something needs to happen that will cause us to recognize where we're headed.
Yeah.
It keeps happening. We keep seeing it. It happens right in front of our eyes. And the problem is we are now so far out of our depth. We are so far out of the environment that we intuit that we don't even realize, nature has ways of telling you that you're on a fatal trajectory, right? The fact that we were all born into a world with no smartphones. The smartphone got invented. We all got one without anybody mandating that we get one. And then we discover that we have a massive wave of addiction that's changing the way we relate to each other, changing the way we spend money, we interact sexually, all of this stuff, right? We did that to ourselves.
Right.
And yet there is no mechanism whereby you can say, was that a mistake? And if it was a mistake, what can we now do about it? The point is, it's now a feature of the landscape, and it can't be undone.
Yeah. So, I mean, we argue, as you have alluded to, for the idea that we have created our own rate of change, which is so fast, which is itself now outstripping even our extraordinary ability as humans to keep up with that rate of change. And what can we do about it? Recognizing it is not sufficient. Right. Imagining that we can go back to some past, which is largely illusory and imaginative, doesn't make any sense, nor should we want it.
Right.
So, we need a future that is unlike one we have yet imagined. But the idea that every future on offer by the newest gadget is something we should embrace, that's crazy. And we're living part of the evidence of that crazy.
Well, and I think even to have the conversation about it is what's frustrating to me so much. We talk about, again, from a pilot perspective, I think this is why I always felt like an island, because it's in my DNA because of my profession of what I have to do. And if you look at the safety record of aviation, for example, look at the United States. I mean, take 9/11 aside, that anomaly. I mean, it's ridiculous how safe it is, right?
Yeah. You're never safer than when you're on a commercial airliner.
Right. And I think a lot of people attribute that safety record. I think a lot of it has to do with smart regulation for sure. But there's a part that I think a lot of people don't see that I think is why it's been so well. And it really changed after the Florida Everglades accident in the 70s. I don't know if you ever heard I forget the airline.
Yeah.
But they were all, basically it was a burned out light bulb in the landing gear indicator. And you basically had 5 or 6 people discussing that. And they crashed a perfectly good airplane into the Everglades. And that's when they really started talking about this crew resource management or cockpit resource management, which is what the standard is today. And the linchpin or the heart of that model is this: it's not your right to challenge, it's your obligation. That is a mindset that has come across, that is embedded in every professional aviation, right? And that's why you don't see, that is, I think, the largest reason why you don't see the crashes anymore. It's because if you're going to be a professional aviator, I'm obligated, like, hey, sir, with all due respect, you're about to do something really stupid here, And you learn how to talk to somebody else and challenge without getting worried about getting your hand slapped,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, this is critical.
and not only that, they're saying it, but you're taught to receive it as well. So it's a dual edge. And I think that gets to the heart of what's missing. Like I can't, and certainly in academia, you guys you've seen this firsthand. You can't respectively disagree with anybody, right? And that's what you see everywhere. Social media. I mean, anyway, sorry for that long kind of explanation, but I just it struck me when I was reading your book that's why it resonated with me so deeply, because that's the world that I live in.
Well, I think you've got it exactly right. And in fact, that the exact issue that you're talking about shows up in many famous crashes. It shows up in the Washington, D.C. crash, where I believe it is the co-pilot understood that they did not, that they couldn't take off, that the icing problem was not, they weren't going to get enough lift, and the pilot overrode them. You see it in the, Tenerife crash?
Yeah, Tenerife was very overbearing captain and,
famous captain, too big for his britches, overrides the tower. So anyway, yes, the obligation to challenge is clear, but I actually want to try an idea on you about why. I mean, we've used aviation as an example of something, that works, where regulation, not only is it highly effective, but it's also liberating, right? All of the constraint that goes into getting you onto an airplane and nobody on the airplane having a weapon and all of that, right, liberates you to fly literally anywhere you want in the world within 24 hours. That's an amazing level of liberty. So it makes the point that regulation is the key to liberty if done well. Right. But I wonder if part of the reason that aviation is so safe actually has to do with a mental distortion. It's the positive version of something we see failing all around us, right? So let's take climate change, for example, right? There's a huge amount of frozen methane in the Arctic that we do not know where the threshold is of temperature that will release so much methane all of a sudden that climate leaps. It no longer gets gradually warmer. It suddenly gets warmer and is completely outside of human control. We don't know where that is, right? And the problem is we're having a dumb reaction to it. If you tried to explain to, an ancestor from 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, if you could talk to them, you could say, look, here's the problem. We're putting out all of this CO2. It's warming the temperature, and there's this huge amount of frozen methane that may be released by this, and it may change the habitability of the planet, and billions might die, right? They would say, well, why don't you stop putting out the CO2? Do you have the technology to do that? Oh, absolutely. We're addicted to cars and things like that. It's like it would be hard to explain why you would take that, why we would fail to do the right thing. On the other hand, if you look at aviation, the 70s, when you point out things started getting really safe, was the era of at least annual motion pictures that focused on an airline disaster that scared the crap out of people. So
that's right.
I remember that era, right? When a plane went down, the news was obsessed with it, right? You saw the collection of body parts, you saw this. And so it gave because we're not well calibrated to detect that we're seeing something very rare on our television as if it's happening in our living room, right? Yeah. Since we don't correct for that well, people had, terror about flying, which is exactly the opposite of what they should have had. And that terror caused them to be motivated in terms of, can we make this safer? And the answer is actually they really did make it a lot safer, right? The airplanes got better, the regulation got good, and the obsession over what went wrong in each case actually resulted in extremely effective regulation.
So let me just push back a little bit, though, not on anything that you just said, I don't think, but the idea that there was an annual or more horror film about an airline disaster created the incentive to really make sure that airline safety was prominent. Maybe. Okay. I think that's at least an interesting factor. But then we can take a different issue where suddenly there was basically a fear campaign to bring awareness to say, the kids' pictures on milk cartons with regard to disappearances, right?
Right.
That then the safetyism there. So safetyism in air travel, yes, please, absolutely, right? Like no one needs us to be playing with tolerances there, and we don't want it. But the idea that what we need to do is slide this all the way to 11, to make sure that no stranger abductions ever happen. And the cost is no children playing outside in the streets, no risk, no serendipity, no exploration. And we have children growing up and they get to 18 with the bodies of adults and the minds still of children. And so there are some things where you do want to say, you know what, fear might actually be a motivator to get us to get, safety to be the one thing that we need to prioritize. And then there are other situations where actually that's really the wrong approach. And then I might also say that, the point about not just the right to challenge, but the obligation to challenge, is necessary over in airplane space and sort of doesn't, where does that even fit over in some of these other places where actually safetyism is a problem, is a bug.
Yeah, I feel an obligation to push back on that, but I agree with you, which puts me on a hard spot. But this does go, we talk in the book about close calls and their importance in training the mind to spot actual hazards in time and to, react in a coordinated and useful way rather than a chaotic way. And what you're pointing to is that, the largely erroneous fear about what was happening to, mild-mannered children playing in front of their houses, right? That nonsense, that panic resulted in a massive change in what children encountered. And therefore, it resulted in the close calls that they encountered being not significant enough, not real enough to train the mind usefully. And then what do you know? You get to 2017 and people are a little unclear on what violence means. And, they fear that they are unsafe in school because of the mention of this, that, and the other thing. And the point, it really, you as you sometimes say, Heather, if you wrote it as a screenplay, it wouldn't be plausible, right? It happened, but if you wrote it, people would be like, no, they'll never be afraid of, they'll never mistake words for violence. That's a bridge too far.
Well, it does speak to, you're right. And the close call section was great in the book, and you retelling the story of your two students, miraculously surviving that building collapse and that earthquake. My God, but the point of that story is key, and it gets to what you're talking about. I mean, we all grew up, I think we're all relatively the same age. I mean, we all, what's the kind of the funny memes of the Gen X thing now? Like, well, when I was a kid, I rode a bike without a helmet and we built ramps out of, rusty nails and plywood and we jumped and we fell and we didn't wear helmets and all that, right? And I tell those stories to my kids and they're incredulous. And I think back, like, my God, what has happened? I have Life 360, and I know where my kids are at all the time. My parents didn't know where I was at for basically 16 hours of the day.
Mm-hmm. No, they didn't,
and it was better for you and for them.
That's right.
Well, let's be fair about it, okay? I know some kids who didn't make it.
Yeah.
Right. As do you.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that is important to say is it's not like, hey, risk is good. The answer is risk is worth it, right?
Right.
A childhood that has...
It's necessary.
It's necessary, which means that a parent has to confront this very frightening fact that a child who has experienced enough risk to actually be a wise adult is a child who was not perfectly safe, right? There's no way to do it with perfect safety. And the job of a parent, among the jobs of a parent, is to manage the level of risk so that the kid makes it, right?
Right.
You want
you said with your students, and just don't leave in a box, right? Our goal is not to leave in a box.
Nobody. Well, we were a little more direct than that. Nobody comes home in a box, which was code for you have the right to take risks, and we expect you to, but you don't have the right to take a risk that might send you home in a box because that risk goes beyond you. That risk goes to your family. That risk goes to the other people on the trip.
Yeah. And I mean, this is a little bit too stark, but we were teaching college students with a range of ages from 19 to mid 30s. But if we're talking about parenting, still, you as a parent can probably guarantee that your kid will reach the age of 18, but at what cost? Right? If what your goal is, if you decide that you have a single static goal, which is survival of your child to the age of 18, that will come at the cost of that child developing the skills, the personality, the experiences with which to navigate the world after that. And frankly, it will then, not only will they be again, a body of an adult with the mind of a child, but then as they so-called fledge, they're much more likely to actually do damage to themselves and others after that because they look like an adult and people will assume they are, but they aren't. How could they possibly be? That's what childhood is. It's when you're supposed to be experiencing all of these things. And yes, it comes with a potential cost, and the potential cost is one that, it's probably the worst one that humans can experience, right? Losing a child, and we have not, and I assume you have not, but but how much greater a societal cost to have an entire generation of people who are alive but incapable.
Well, and I think again it speaks to COVID highlighted it all. I mean, I think if you look at the average, I don't know, a guy that's out there every day, he's, welding things, he's running band saws, he's sawing things, he's hammering things, he's almost cutting his finger off. He's probably not that worried about COVID. And I'm not saying it from a political standpoint. I'm saying it from a risk assessment. He knows every day, every time he turns on a bandsaw, he's doing his mind is the muscle of a risk assessment is there. And the vast majority of us are staring at blue screens, and the biggest risk that we have is carpal tunnel syndrome. I don't know. I mean, am I going to be, if that's me and if that's my world, am I, no, I don't think anybody's doing the work when they look at like the news and everything that comes down, and just COVID is one example of like, okay, well, what level of risk are we talking about here? Are we talking about, is it the same risk level as flying an airplane, of driving a car, of deep sea fishing? What? I mean, right? Yeah. None of that's getting talked about. And it drives me
is it
crazy.
the same risk for everyone, regardless of the other factors in your life, like whether or not you have comorbidities or, or are old? So the idea of a single static risk that extends equally to all humans, and it is the only one that we need to be paying attention to, is not humane, frankly.
Yeah, the guy with the bandsaw, unfortunately, is getting COVID wrong too frequently, right? Because the guy with the fact is we now know an awful lot about what puts you at risk. And the fact is, if the guy with the bandsaw is 40 and athletic, and either lives in a climate where he gets a lot of sunlight or supplements with vitamin D in an aggressive way, then he may actually be correct in feeling like, I don't think this is too dangerous a virus to me. On the other hand, if he's 40 pounds overweight, right, or living, at a high latitude and not thinking about his vitamin D levels, he may be at serious risk. Even more risk if his doctor...
Or has to commute to his job on public transit or something.
Right.
Even worse if his doctor is in a social environment where the doctor can't afford to think for himself, and so the doctor adheres to this ridiculous program of encountering people who are sick and sending them home to get the people they live with sick and not treating them until it's an emergency. Right. So there are all kinds of things about COVID that are hard to intuit, which has resulted, frankly, in us choosing, without any rational defense, to vaccinate children who are, in fact, unless they have serious comorbidities, almost totally safe from this disease, in order, in theory, to protect older, infirm people. Right. So somehow we have collectively botched this job, and we have given people a one-size-fits-all diagnosis and prognosis and solution, and how many months later now, and we're still pretending that this all somehow makes sense?
Yeah. Why do you think, in a bigger picture, that the conversations don't happen? I mean, why does it get so polarized? I think instinctively I know why they get polarized, but why doesn't the average 45-year-old, and maybe they do and I just don't see them, but why doesn't the average 45-year-old sit there and turn on the radio, the TV, and pick any channel? I don't care, right or left, doesn't matter. But why does it seem like that nobody's seeing through the bullshit? Why does it seem like so many people take the bullshit and like it's no big, like, oh yeah. I mean, is it, from an evolutionary standpoint, is it because, are we stupid? Do we like to, is it like a hunter-gatherer thing, like kind of leads to fundamentalism in the sense that I mean that fundamentalism likes tribes. I don't know. What do you think?
It's not that. Let's give them their due.
And we're not a stupid species, right?
Yeah.
Right.
No.
Right. Exactly. We're smart.
And the vast
okay.
majority of us, I mean, I know you want to answer this and I want to say something too, but I will say that teaching at Evergreen for 15 years with a really wide, like actual diversity of students, like across all the demographic markers, including age and, first in their family to go to college and, all as veterans and grandmothers and all of this. It made me much less of a misanthrope. I think I went into that job thinking, people are probably just stupid. They can't figure it out, whatever.
Yeah.
No, almost everyone is capable of deep insight and care.
Yeah, especially if you get to them early, which was
and I believe that, and because I see it in my kids, I see it. I mean, I believe that in human beings. I always want to focus on the strengths, not the weaknesses. I'm with you.
Okay, but let's address your question because I think you don't see the reason that people are wired to behave in this way until you look at it evolutionarily, and you realize, first of all, human beings are not built to be right. Right? Being right is a means to an end. And when being wrong leads better to that end, human beings embrace wrong. Right? So, for example, if you take all of the what we would call metaphorical beliefs, if you take all of the religious beliefs that we can prove in a laboratory aren't true, right? Would the ancestor 5,000 years ago have been better off abandoning the mysticism and embracing the idea of, hey, let's make laboratories and figure out what's really going on? No, they'd be much better off embracing the mysticism of their group and taking it in deeply and operationalizing it. And so what I'm getting at is this. Human beings, just as we have a CO2 detector that keeps us from suffocating in an enclosed space.
CO2.
Yeah. We have a CO2 detector. We also have a early starvation warning detector. And when people start making noises like, oh, you just don't get it, you're not one of us, in fact, you're a hazard to us, right? That is a direct threat to future ability to feed self, right? Because humans cannot feed themselves in any environment. No individual human can feed themselves in any environment on Earth alone indefinitely. Right? You may think, oh, well, I'll fish my way out of it. Well, you're going to need fish hooks, and I bet you don't know enough metallurgy to make them. So, right?
Right.
So anyway, the point is human beings are inherently collective. And that means that when the other members of your collective start looking at you funny, like you're the problem, you begin to fear that you're about to starve because they're going to drive you to the edge of the village and, wish you good luck as you, head off into the unknown. So what that means is all of this online nonsense is people triggering that in each other, right?
Yeah.
If you express skepticism about certain things, then the point is, oh, you're the witch, right? And so it is that. And, I don't mean to make light of it here. What I'm saying is, as much as I'm sure all three of us definitely want people to stand up and say what needs to be said, it is not surprising that they do so infrequently, because the threat, even if in modern circumstances, is not really a threat to your ability to feed yourself. It feels like one for very good historical reasons.
And the main mechanism, it seems, the main emotion that the tribalism is being enforced with is fear. And you said that in what you just said, Bret, but fear is driving people, and whether or not they recognize it. And I was just thinking the other day, I would so much rather be angry than afraid. And I don't want either, right? But there are situations that people could respond to with anger or fear. And anger feels like a response that is more temporary, that it can end, it can be finite. You can say, wow, that was, hopefully I didn't lose my hopefully I didn't do anything that I now need to go fix, but it's over. Whereas fear has this lingering presence that just grabs you, and it's very hard to escape from.
Yes, and I guess the final, maybe it's not the final, but a next piece of the puzzle is you say people don't spot the bullshit. They do, almost overwhelmingly, but they respond to it incoherently, right? In other words, because we are built to grow up in an environment and then to intuit that environment so that we don't have to carefully, consciously think through most things in order to function well, right? We are built to flow through life and to reserve consciousness for those rare circumstances where something is really surprising to us. But for us, we don't intuit well because we don't live as adults in the environment we grew up in, so our intuitions are terribly tutored. And as people do detect correctly that the system is rigged against them, that it is not serving their interests most of the time, that the governance stuff is theater, right, at best. At best it's indifferent to them. Sometimes it's actually downright hostile to their interests. They move to an intuitive layer about what must be true, and they embrace nonsense, ideas that don't add up. They're very susceptible to con artists and stuff like this. And so the real problem is they do detect the bullshit. They don't have the first clue what to do next in general, right? And that's what we need to begin to discuss more widely.
Yeah. So that was amazing. That's really great insight. And I agree. I'm about to get banished from the tribe and starve. So it kind of triggers that. That makes perfect sense. So before I get to that, I want to say this about fear. I want to see what you guys think about this. I agree with you that, and that's the first I'd ever heard that, Heather, and I love that it's easier for me to be angered than fearful. It's much more acceptable or pleasurable, maybe, because sometimes there's some pleasure in anger, of getting angry, right? I mean, I don't know. But I know from my teaching, like one thing I'm very passionate about, and I get this from being in the Marine Corps and doing this and flying, but the fear and uncertainty never goes away, right? And I think a lot of times we see self-help or people talking or this myth thinking that the fear and uncertainty goes away. It's a blessing, right? I think fear actually is a barometer of what you should do next, right? It points in the direction of what you should do if you embrace it. And that's why I kind of look at fear as a blessing. And for me, it seems like if we could get people to kind of embrace that and be the composed force in a chaotic situation, I think that is the key, the ticket. You know, if you can be the composed force in a chaotic situation, the world's your oyster. You can pretty much, live a significant life, a very significant life. And that's what I try to talk. And so I think for me, it's like getting people to understand, stop. There's no such thing as a fearless warrior, right? There's no such thing.
They die quick.
That's right. And there's no such thing as, and I like to look at us all as creators, right? As creators, we always have a choice. I can choose how to, you come at me angry, yelling, fomenting, and telling me all this or that. The bottom line is I have a choice. Nobody can take that away from me, The guy's name is escaping me. What is his name? The Holocaust survivor that wrote the book. Why is his name escaping me?
Elie Wiesel?
No, he wrote a book called, why is it? Oh, this is driving me crazy. I'll have to look this up. But he wrote a book, and that was his whole thing. Is like, that's why he as a young child, he survived, as a teenager, survived the Holocaust. He looked at us as tormentors, not as persecutors. He looked at them as challengers, if that makes sense. And you're always at a choice. Doesn't mean that the choice is easy or comfortable or pleasurable, but you're always at a choice. And I think for me, if understanding that you're always at a choice and that fear is not something to be banished, but instead to be embraced. And if you can be the composed force in that situation, to me, that's the secret to a significant life. Anyway, what are your thoughts when you hear me say that, Furman?
I absolutely. Fear is, I think people basically get negative emotions wrong. Right. In fact,
I agree.
Right up to the point of our psychological authorities and medical authorities treating pain as if it were an illness of its own, right? Rather than saying, are you in pain because you're doing something wrong that you could stop doing, right? Mm-hmm. Right. That's the first question. If it's phantom pain in a limb you no longer have, let's treat that. But if you've got social angst and pain because you're being a jerk to people who would otherwise care about you, then let's get you not to be a jerk rather than let's anesthetize your pain, right?
Right.
So
the idea being that these are actual signals and that there are things about the modern environment which may render them unreliable signals. But certainly until sort of yesterday, evolutionarily speaking, actual pain and also mental pain were usually reliable signals to actually you need to change something about your situation if you at all can.
Right. And it's a perfect test case for does the market successfully supplant the ancestral version, right? If you've hired a shrink to make you feel better, then they may very well make you feel better. If you go to a clergy member and you say, I feel terrible, and they know the story from the perspective of other members of your community, and the fact is you were a jerk and now you're being isolated and that's why you're in pain, they'll give you much higher quality advice because you haven't hired them, right? But anyway, to the point about fear, there's a truth about people who don't feel pain, which is that they do die early because they don't learn, they don't become programmed to avoid damage, right? So they literally lose many decades of life. The same thing can be said, presumably, for people who do not have a normal, healthy relationship with fear, right? If you do not have healthy fears, then you will be foolhardy. And so, fully agree, the key to courage is not an absence of fear, it is a healthy relationship with fear, which results in a piece of advice that I think I haven't yet figured out how to phrase it so people can hear it. But the advice is, if you face something truly frightening, you actually should not shield yourself from staring into the abyss. You should stare into the abyss long enough that you can manage your relationship with it. That this actually, it's awful, but it does make you stronger. And in some sense, I think we're watching a whole civilization of people who are too terrified to look at where we are rather than inclined to look at where we are so that we know what to do about it.
Well, I think that that picks up on the one way that I would sort of just reframe the conversation, which is that fear is necessary, fear is adaptive, but fear is also so easily weaponizable, especially in our modern world, that fear is being used as the tool by which to control people. And so if you will stare into the abyss, and you are likely to discover when the abyss that you've been told exists actually is a Wile E. Coyote paint spot on the ground, right? It's a fakery. So even more reason to be willing to stare into the abyss. Sometimes it's an actual abyss, and you need to know it and just then carry that knowledge with you as you go forward. And sometimes it turns out that the thing that you're spending all of your time avoiding looking at and avoiding thinking at and, turning on your friends who disagree with you because of it, you look at it and you say, wait, that's not what I was told it was. It turns out I have no reason for fear in this circumstance.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that it speaks to what you're talking about in the book, that you got to get out and live in the physical world, and the kind of the lessons that you learn with your students on these trips that you guys would take. And I don't know what the young woman's name who or the two of them that survived the hotel collapse around them.
Yeah, Odette.
I mean, what an awful thing. I mean, I just can't imagine what that going through. But I can tell you one thing, they're better people because of it now.
They have the makings of superheroes by virtue of their having lived through something most people will never live through.
Exactly.
And having the knowledge that one can actually navigate such a thing. It's really, in many ways, it's a terrible gift, but it's a gift.
That's right.
It's a gift nonetheless. Absolutely right. So this is all fun and it's great. And I'm learning a lot. And again, I'm more biceps curls are happening in my brain right now. And so I feel good, but I don't feel good about what it seems overwhelming. How do we get to the fourth frontier? How do we get people to embrace it? I mean, I read it. Yeah. I love what you're saying.
Well, but I must say I hear a kindred spirit over there. And I think we need to not overthink it, right?
Yeah.
This is a conversation between people who have looked at the abyss, and it isn't a fake one. It's real. And this conversation does not sound like people panicking. It does not sound like people you couldn't sit down and have a drink with, or a conversation about something fun, or, I think the point is what you imagine about those who believe that we are in dire circumstances and that there is great urgency with which we must act isn't actually right. Right? Unless you've been in that room, you don't know. And so in some sense, I hope, as weird and novel and strange as podcasting is, it does allow people to do something, as listeners. It's not as passive as watching television, right? They're actually tuning in on a real conversation.
It's an intimacy there that you can't replicate in any other media or medium that's out there.
And there are communities, who discuss podcasts and debate what they hear and all of that. And so I think hopefully what will happen is as people hear rational discussion about the fact that we have various possible futures ahead of us, some of them quite bleak, but some of them potentially remarkable, and that there is even those of us who believe that there is something to be done are concerned we won't do it. We have hope that we might. We haven't given up, right? That, I think, will bring people in on the conversation, and, then they'll, if they hear the content and the answer is, well, actually, maybe the thing to do is to look at what I'm afraid of, to stare at the abyss long enough that it doesn't panic me to think about it, right? That, we can bootstrap the capacity to confront it.
I think in terms of inspiring people, which is, your answer is sort of at the individual level, which is certainly where I'm more comfortable trying to figure out the solutions as well. But encouraging people to stare in the abyss, which can't be done by sort of school marmy instruction, just stare into it, right? But, through sort of invitation to listening in on conversations like this one, as Bret said, is one side of it. But just like speciation involves both, or how many species there are involves both speciation and extinction, there's another side to this, which is how to inspire people, how to encourage people to figure out what it is that they are actually passionate about. Because, we have for sure a crisis of meaning among people. And this is part of what the, locking kids down so that they're guaranteed to survive to their 18th birthdays has done to people. They don't know what the possibilities are. They don't know if they are, in fact, creators, as you say, or discoverers, or explorers, or healers, or communicators, or leaders, or, any of the number of other words that I could use to describe some of the extraordinary human activities that we've been engaging in since we've been human, right? And, some of us aren't healers, but some are extraordinary healers, and some people out there right now who are coming of age will never know, because they haven't been allowed the opportunity to discover what it is that they are terrific at. So not just stare into the abyss, listen to the conversations among people who actually aren't, boring or hateful, but, really looking for an amazing future, but also, what is it that you could bring to the world? Maybe it's art. Maybe it's scientific discovery. Maybe it's exploration with others of new places and returning to tell the tale. It could be a lot of things. But I hear very little. I mean, we used to see this in our classrooms. We used to see people who sort of had the lights turned on about, oh, well, there's a giant world out there. Yeah. And it's extraordinary that it takes, frankly, just compassionate college professors to reveal that. And I'm concerned that most people are not being exposed to even that at this point.
My biggest fear is this lack of seeking to understand. I mean, your book, to me, your book is all about that. I mean, it's this seeking to understand. I wish I could. How do you turn on the curiosity switch? I don't know. I'm insatiably curious. And I think the key to whatever solution we have, and it does begin at the individual level. To your point, I mean that sometimes, and to your point, Bret, let's don't overcomplicate things. At least maybe you can't change the world, but at least you can change your part of it, and that can expand and grow and catch fire, hopefully. And your book is, like you said, it's an evolutionary toolkit. And what I love about your book is that it is about seeking to understand the human condition. I mean, that's what I got out of your book. And I wish every conversation that I had every single day was about that. And it's not about justifying it either. I think so many times everybody tries to plant a flag. I don't know why everybody feels like they have to plant a flag and say, I'm right, you're wrong. And I think you did a really good job in the book of explaining the human condition and not justifying it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so. I think it is a common misunderstanding of an evolutionary perspective that by trying to understand what we are evolutionarily is in turn a justification of everything that humans do that can be pointed, that for which an evolutionary explanation can be revealed. And of course, this isn't true. Our argument is really quite the opposite. How better to change the worst parts of human nature than to understand all of what we are as fully as possible, and then move forward and work to embrace the beautiful things that evolution has handed us and work to minimize the awful things, because evolution has handed us both, mother's love and genocide, kindness to strangers and rape. These are all four of those things are evolutionary, and two of them are lovely and two of them are not.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I can go back to one point, though, you say, how do we turn on the curiosity? And this is going to sound pat, but I'm so convinced it's essential. The key is just don't turn it off, right? What we do to children is we take that curiosity and we shut it down, and we do so with lackluster teachers who don't want to be exposed for not knowing things. And so, anybody who's raised a child has heard that child ask really difficult questions, right? It happens. Some of their questions are nonsense. Some of their questions aren't. But if your idea is, I'm going to stand at the front of the classroom and I'm going to demonstrate, that I am the one with the knowledge, and I'm going to pour the knowledge into your head. And if you ask a question I don't know the answer to, then you've done something wrong. Well, then, okay, it's not surprising that when they reach adulthood that asking good questions isn't something that they are skilled at. But we could stop doing that. I mean, we are, what we are as evolved creatures is curious. Why? Because curiosity allows you to detect opportunities that you don't see. It allows you to spot hazards that will otherwise catch you off guard. So we are built that way for a reason, and all we have to do is not mess it up, and it emerges and produces a much richer life.
Mm-hmm. I agree 100%. Do you guys, I guess where it gets overwhelming, I'll do the work individually, but I look at these institutions, I look at academia, I look at government, and I'm like, oh my God, I don't know how. Have you guys ever read that book, The Fourth Turning? Have you ever heard of the book, The Fourth Turning? Have you ever heard of that
Haven't
book?
read it. Know of it.
Yeah, same here.
For those who haven't, who's listening, I mean, it's basically I think it was written in like 97 or something like that. It's not updated, but it's certainly interesting how it kind of just looks at the historical cycles of history, or the cycles of history, and that there's basically 80 to 100-year cycles, and you got 4 20-year, 25-year time spans. And for brevity, I mean, we're in the crisis mode, right? And if you go back 80 years, the last crisis mode was the Depression, World War II. You go back 80 years, it was a Civil War. You go back 80 years, it was the Revolutionary War. And there's another one, I don't know what happened in the 1600s, but on Western civilization. But it's interesting how it follows that pattern. And if you read it, we're in this kind of crisis mode. And I kind of believe that. I mean, from a historical, we all kind of know we're kind of at a crisis inflection point. Do you think, I guess my question goes is like, what has to happen to academia? What has to happen to the government? What has to happen financially? I guess I see a financial collapse. I see the government, the two-party system that is right now is something's got to change drastically. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to see where your thoughts on all I said there.
Well, there's a problem, which is that there may be a lot to this fourth turning idea, but the crisis we're in isn't that, right? It may overlap with it. It may be that we're in that crisis also, but there's something, I think, unduly comforting about the idea that this is a cyclic pattern, that as bad as things are, we will.
Yeah, there's something good on the other side of it,
right?
Yeah,
that is not where we are. And, I don't think our book is in any way depressing, but there is a message in it about the fact that we are off the end of the tape, right? We have now done something that has taken even our extreme capacity to deal with novelty and outstripped it. And so the answer is either we figure out how to undo that, or nature's going to figure it out for us, and it isn't going to be pretty. So really, in some sense, this is a call to arms. There is still the capacity to put us back on track, right? it would necessarily be dark as we pass through what evolutionists would call the adaptive valley. But we really don't have a choice. We have done something. We have taken what we are capable of. And it's like hiking up Everest, right? There comes a point very late in that hike where there isn't actually enough oxygen for you to do this safely, for you to think clearly, right? At the point you've crossed into that zone, you have to have a plan for getting back out of it. And we are there. Evolutionarily speaking, we are built to adapt extremely rapidly, but we are now changing our environment so quickly that even that amazing capacity to adapt is simply not up to the challenge. So we have to deliver the next generations, the future generations, a world in which that isn't true anymore, right? It doesn't have to be a bleak world. It can be a marvelous world, but it can't be one that changes so rapidly they can't keep up.
So is the concern for you one more of resources and the planet and the environment, or is it more of the political media, kind of all that kind of jumbled mess of politics, media, not being able to talk to each other, not being able to have civil conversations, because they all affect each other. I mean, they're all interrelated. I mean, if a left and a right talks about climate change and it follows the normal tropes, we know where it's going to go, right? Something has to change in that, at least having the conversation. And I think I heard you somewhere, you gave a great example of like, well, let's don't focus on talking about what you come from the place of where we agree, right? Like we can, no matter what the topic is, these red button or hot button issues that we seem to disagree with on left and right. I still don't know how we get people to have these conversations where we focus on what we agree on. I agree 100% that that's what we need to do, but I just don't know how to get there. But again, I ask a lot there, but I guess my first question was, is it more about resources and environmental to you? Is that what you think the collapse is, or is it more cultural?
So let me just quickly answer before you go on. I would say, 20 years ago, the answer for me would have been easy. It may have been wrong, but it would have been easy for me to say it's the former, it's resources. Because, say what you will about the models that are being used to generate our understanding of climate change or our lack of understanding, depending on where you stand. We're experiencing habitat loss. We've seen it firsthand in many, many places. Mm-hmm. The earth is finite, right? Resources are finite. And even if you thought that you could start mining stuff from some other place, we only have one earth. We only have one habitable planet. Mm-hmm. That said, that may have been the thing that ramped up the incoherence and chaos in the political and media sphere, which was then completely exaggerated by technological innovations like the smartphone, like social mm-hmm. media, and then just the perfect storm of, we have parenting styles that create children who don't know what to do and who are willing to drug them with legal drugs so that they don't know how to control their own moods. Right. So, all of that sort of happened simultaneously. Is that coincidence? It seems not.
Yeah, I'm going to take a slightly different tack because I think it's very easy to get bogged down in innumerable examples of hazards, many of which are resource-based, some of which are not. They're all symptoms. I guess at this moment, I almost wonder, as much as I like the title of our book, I wonder if it shouldn't have been called Hypernovelty, because the risk to humans is hypernovelty. That's what's happening. And the problem is, what will that look like in the end? It could look like slaughter bots, right? It could look like swarms of killer drones that are purchasable at a reasonable price so that one of these political entities will start availing themselves of that power in order to shape markets and politics and other phenomena. It could be the class rate gun hypothesis of the methane frozen in the Arctic, right? It could be that it's it could be frankly, the lowering of the price point on creating novel viruses. And as much as COVID may not be an extinction level event, that's not to say that somebody with a purpose might not engineer such a thing. It could be a Carrington event that causes the stored nuclear fuel in all of the civilian nuclear reactors to spill into the environment and cause a refugee crisis that will have existential implications. And the basic point is all those things are the result of the same problem. They're the result of the fact that we, once upon a time, had the power to make errors that would cause our lineage to go extinct, but our lineage was not synonymous with the whole human race. Now our errors are such that we can take out the human race in one failure to recognize a hazard. And we either are going to somehow overcome our political corruption problem and engineer a solution to that where at least we can get very high quality minds focused together on the question of what do we do about the hazards we keep creating for humanity? How do we rein in that problem so that we can live well without constantly facing new existential threats? Or we won't, in which case it'll be one of them. And it doesn't really much matter which one it is, right? It'll be something.
Yeah. Yeah. Not pleasant to hear, but I think you're right.
Better you hear it from me than as the cosmos swallows you up.
That's right. But you're right. Or even like the solar, like this, a massive solar event. There's all kinds of things that could happen and trigger.
Well, for people, the massive solar, the Carrington event to which you just referred, obviously that isn't the result of humanity.
No.
It's our fragile systems that are built on imagining that it can never happen. That is what makes it an existential threat. Right?
Exactly.
Right. That's the irony of the thing, is that these events have happened throughout human history and prehistory to no meaningful effect because we hadn't plugged nuclear reactors into electric grids that are vulnerable to solar storms. So in some sense, we don't have an intuition for it, which is why we apparently run a 1 in 8 risk every decade of a major grid destroying event that's plugged into all sorts of things that most people have never thought about.
Right. It's not like, oh my God, remember that winter storm when we were out of power for 2 weeks, right? This is it's not
no,
that
this
low.
Is
right. This is civilization destroying risk.
Yep. Yeah, and in fact, it's a really important example. If people want to check it out, I wrote a piece for Unheard. On how the world might end on this topic. Yeah, in the last year somewhere. And the point about this one is, in the case of something like climate change, we all understand that there are people who have a stake in our current trajectory such that they don't want us to fix the problem because there's a perverse incentive. In the case of the Carrington event issue, there's no opposition. Every human being who wants to see human beings continue to live on this planet ought to be on the same side of the issue. And the solution isn't even expensive. It's so cheap that we could solve it and nobody would notice it.
No one would know.
No one would know. And yet we don't fix it. And so what that says is that somehow our intuitions are far enough off that even with something that actually has humanity destroying potential, no reason for political opposition, it's the lowest hanging fruit conceivable, we still don't pick it.
Yeah. And it's because of that's what just, again, makes me feel like I'm on an island sometimes. But that's why we have you in writing A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, also known as Hypernovelty. You guys did a great job there. I wish I could talk to you 3 hours. I do have another podcast coming up in 15 minutes, so I got to get near the end. Who are you hoping picks up your book?
This is going to sound like a non-answer, but our editor asked us that after we signed the contract, and it's been a book had been talking about writing for over 10 years. And she said, just before you begin to write, I'd like to get a sense from you of who your intended audience is. And I happened to be on the phone alone with her, so my answer to her was kind of everyone. Mm-hmm. And the reason I could say that without sounding like I'm completely clueless, I think, is precisely because the people we were reaching in our classrooms for 15 years as professors at this, weird and wacky public liberal arts college with an incredible diversity of students was kind of everyone. So, we offer up new evolutionary ideas in this book. And so, it is something that we hope that is taken seriously by, professional scientists. But we also hope to be writing at a level that it's approachable and accessible by just about anyone. And we think that it has potential value to everyone.
And in fact, the reason that we chose the metaphor of campfire is that it works exactly this way, right? I mean, we are talking about a literal campfire that we believe happened, hundreds of thousands of times in our evolutionary past. But the idea is, it is almost inconceivable, right, that in one of those ancestral campfires that it would have been, this is a hunters only campfire, right? this is for the adults, right? Right. The point is, everybody's at the campfire, and so the idea is whatever matters to the lineage is being discussed. Everybody participates at the level that they're ready to engage at, which does, it's not a hierarchy. The fact is, people have different strengths and weaknesses. The fact is, the child who doesn't know enough to participate in the planning of the response to whatever it is may have the perfect mind to ask the question that nobody else thinks to ask. And so, that's the nature of campfire, is that it really is this emergent mind, right? That this is not a metaphor. Right, just because the minds aren't plugged into each other with wetware, because they're plugged into each other through the air, it seems kind of loose, but it's not. This is the way human minds work, and so
So include everyone in the conversation who's willing and interested.
Come to the table with what you got.
Yeah.
Well, I love the table you guys are creating, and it's been an honor to be able to sit next to you and talk with this. I've been I'll be honest with you, this was the conversation I've been most looking forward to, and it's been a true honor to have you on the show. I hope we can do this again sometime. I hope we can stay in touch. I think you guys are doing God's work. I really do. I think you guys are doing great stuff. And,
thank you. We'd enjoy that.
Yeah, we would love to do it again. You're welcome on our island anytime.
Yeah. How can people reach out to you, learn more about you? You got a great podcast. You got the book. How can people reach out to you?
Yeah, we have Dark Horse Podcast, which we live stream every Saturday. Bret Weinstein's Dark Horse Podcast. That's the full name. We have the book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, which is, as of yesterday, back in stock at Amazon for the first time since 3 days after publication. So it's back now. And we have websites, heatherheying.com, I think, and bretweinstein.net. Yeah. And
I'll have links to all that. Yep, I'll have links to all that on the show notes. And my gosh, what a great conversation. I know my mind, and I'm a better person for sitting down with you guys. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. This was great.